Good morning. So glad you could be with me today in our Unfolding the Word study. As you know, we're in Daniel, continuing to examine the second chapter of Daniel, which introduces us to the king's dream sent by God, a dream that introduces the king to the fact that God is the Lord of history, the one who sets people up, takes them down, the one who watches over the unfolding plan of history. Now, today I want to pick up our reading in chapter 2, beginning in verse 31, a passage now where Daniel is actually sharing with the king the content of the dream to get the opportunity to be able to interpret the dream. So follow along as I look at these verses. Chapter 2 of Daniel, verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken into pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. You remember, the inability to understand this dream was what was driving Nebuchadnezzar to issue the death sentence for his Magi order, who seemed unable to give him the meaning of the dream or even the dream itself. And now Daniel, and we've seen the process that brought him to this point, Daniel is standing before him and directed by God, interpreting the dream. First of all, telling him the dream, and then interpreting it. Now let's look at this dream itself today. And Lord willing, we'll look at the interpretation of it tomorrow. But Daniel comes and meets the first of the requirements before the king, and that is to tell the king the dream that the king wouldn't tell anybody. Now, as I mentioned to you already, the meaning of this dream is not going to be a positive meaning for Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to disappoint him. It's going to confront his aspirations, his goals, his intentions. And so it was not a comfortable place to be. But nonetheless, this is where God had Daniel. And Daniel moves forward boldly to tell it. So now, as required by the king, Daniel tells the king the dream that the king told no one. It proves that he knows the dream and that he can then later interpret it. He met the impossible requirement with God's help, of course, because he had clearly given God the grace and also had given God all the credit for being able to tell the king the things that he would. So now, after he shares this meaning of the king or the actual dream, he will then move on to interpret it for the dream. This was the king's filtering device, and Daniel went through it. Now, as he tells the dream is built around a very graphic picture. And that was a graphic picture of a great image. When the terminology of great image is used here, picture it as a great statue, because that's really what it was. A huge statue in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. A great statue. A huge statue. It wasn't a work of art. It wasn't like Michelangelo's sculpture or something. That's not the picture. The picture was, it was an awe-inspiring, a scary statue. Huge, frightening. In fact, he uses this terminology. The dream introduced you to an image, a statue that was mighty, that was frightening in appearance. In other words, it was an awe-inspiring thing. No wonder for the king, his dream was interrupting his sleep, and he couldn't get sleep. Because if it, in fact, was a frightening appearance, he would want to know what it meant. and why he wants that fright removed. He wants the intimidation gone. Now, this great and frightening statue, according to Daniel's understanding as God gave it to him, had a very unique makeup. And this would have also been in the king's mind as he was perplexed over what that could mean. The statue is made up of a head of gold, and then we go on down all the way to a feet made up of iron and clay. The head was gold. The arms, the chest, the torso, in other words, were silver. The belly and the thighs of this huge image were bronze. The legs were made up of iron, and the feet were a mixed iron and clay. That was the image. So far, so good. The king knew that Daniel understood the dream. He was able to tell him those details that the king couldn't get out of his mind, but was unwilling to tell anyone. Now, as the dream unfolds, as this frightening image is impacting on the king, the climax of the dream is that at some point a stone strikes the feet of the king, of the statue, I mean. A stone comes and hits it. And the stone, as it comes, that struck the ground, that struck it, is that the stone broke and crumbled the feet. And the effect of that was that the statue crashed. The issue wasn't only that the statue crashed. You know, you can picture a big statue falling over and maybe even breaking into some pieces. The scripture tells us that the dream shows that not only did it crash, but it turned to dust, and then the dust was scattered so that there was nothing left. Nothing. What had been a mighty image, a frightening appearance, now was only an illusion, gone. All you could do is remember what it had been because it was not there any longer. The dream ends with the stone not only destroying the statue, this great frightening appearance, but the stone then itself begins to grow and becomes a mountain, and not only a mountain, but a mountain that then fills the entire earth. A frightening statue, a total destruction of the statue, a stone that destroys the statue and then grows and fills the entire earth. There's the dream. Therein is the perplexity for Nebuchadnezzar. What can this mean? What can be the implications of this? Why did God send it to me? And it is now time for Daniel to turn his attention to giving an interpretation of these events. And so Nebuchadnezzar, you can just picture him, can't you? He's now had this proof positive that Daniel knew the dream. Only one other person in the world knew the dream. Nebuchadnezzar now had someone to share this frightening appearance with. And now Daniel, who demonstrated the ability to know the dream, is going to demonstrate the ability to interpret it, which was really the key for the king. It wasn't just having someone who could say, I know the dream you had. That was the filtering device, of course. But the real issue for the king was, what does this mean? And Daniel now, empowered by God, with insight given by God, is able to turn attention to Nebuchadnezzar and say, this is what this statue is all about. This is what the head of gold is. This is what the silver, this is what the bronze, this is what the iron, this is what the mixed clay and iron is all about. This is what the stone is. This is what the mountain becomes. This is what God is trying to tell you. But more importantly, what God is telling the world. Join me tomorrow as we turn attention to the interpretation of the dream for Nebuchadnezzar and for you and I. God bless.